Thank you very much to those joining us live for something that's fairly new that we're giving a try to, the AusPoll live video chat. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by Professor Greg Barton, who will be known to you as a really valued part also of our AusPoll Twitter community. Welcome to you, Greg.
Good morning, Denise.
And Greg, of course, you're the Professor of Global Islamic Politics at Alfred Deakin. I'm reading this because you've got quite a long title, Alfred Deakin Institute for Globalisation and Citizenship.
Yes, that's at Deakin University, yes.
Very good. And a regular tweeter, and I have to say tweet on quite a large range of issues. You don't just stick to your knitting.
No, fools rush in where angels fear to tread, as they say, yes.
Exactly. And of course, there are so many issues that you can now really get across, and in some way, I suppose it's all quite interconnected with your core expertise.
I'd like to think there are connections. I mean, my PhD was looking at formist thought in Indonesia, which led to democratic change, and that remains an abiding interest. I began to pay attention to the other end of Islamic thought, the other end of the spectrum after the 9/11 attacks, and look at Islamic or Islamist extremism. But the people that I work with in Southeast Asia who are trying to fight against the influence of extremists, moderate and progressive Muslim NGOs for the most part. So there's a connection, and it's pretty clear now. In many ways, the events of this year have reminded us that there's a link between what happens in the political sphere and what people in social movements, even acting by themselves in imagined communities, are prepared to do to the point of violence.
Yes, and let's deep dive into that now that you've given me that segue. And I'll also say thanks to everyone who's joining us live, and please feel free to comment. Those who are logged in can actually make some comments as we're speaking, and even perhaps ask Greg or I a question, but thank you again. Of course, what we're seeing globally, sadly, is this rise of extremism. We saw it, of course, with what happened, particularly at home. It was quite close to home with what happened in Christchurch, with the person that did that, of course, being Australian. We perhaps also saw it in Sri Lanka quite recently. You've referred to it as something called the Great Displacement. I also note what happened in Sydney last week with what we referred to on Twitter as hashtag Sydney stabbing, where it was quite interesting and really sort of hit home to me the responsibility that we really need to take in the language that we're using around these kind of events, because this person, of course, shouted some Muslim rhetoric, I suppose you could call it, but there was some discussion about, look, it's a mental health issue. Is he doing this to provoke an action rather than any allegiance to Islam? But then, of course, some journalists and some media picked that up very quickly, and I was quite disturbed to watch it happen before my very eyes over a matter of hours. That language then really go around the world to extremists really sort of stating as its fact without looking at the broader context. What role does all of this have in the rise of extremism we're seeing?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Denise.
Yes, I know. Sorry, I've deep dive in. We've got a little bit of time, so feel free.
Sure. Well, let me start with the Sydney stabbing. We had an incident a couple of years ago in the far north of Queensland where a man who turned out was French Algerian and of Muslim background, as it turned out, on a problem with drugs and some degree of obviously not being healthy mentally, but he wasn't insane. Stabbed somebody at the backpackers hostel where he was staying, and unfortunately stabbed in a way that a life was lost. Now, as he stabbed, apparently he said Allahu Akbar, which just means God is the greatest. It was interesting. I was struck by the fact that Australian media very quickly said, well, that doesn't mean that he's acting out of terrorist motive just because he's made an expression. I mean, if you had a fight in a pub in Dublin, people would be using all of those expressions. It wouldn't mean they're acting out of the name of religion. It's what happens when people get emotional. They turn back to whatever sort of most sort of primordial expressions of sentiment, which often involve religious utterances. So it was good that Australian media handled that maturely. It turned out to be drug and some degree of unhappy personality that led to a murderous attack, an act of rage, which was tragic. What happened in Sydney last week, of course, coincidentally, we had a Channel 7 cameraman on the way back from a job who captured it on film, and we appeared to have the man with the knife yelling Allahu Akbar, although he didn't pronounce it very well, suggesting he wasn't familiar with saying it. But what was very clear was he said, "Come and shoot me," or words to that effect, "shoot me in the head." And it looked like somebody who was trying to get a police response and effect death, suicide by police. Of course, some elements of the media said, well, it must be an Islamist terrorist. But for the most part, I think the media was quite responsible and said, well, that doesn't necessarily follow. New South Wales Police was very careful in the way they framed their response. They said, we're not pursuing this as a terrorist investigation. There was a USB along with his phone found with evidence items about other recent attacks like the Christchurch attack, but that didn't prove intent. Of course, police reserved the fact that they'd go back to this incident, and if it was shown that there was actual political intent, which is the definition of terrorism, they would recast their investigation. But for the time being, it appears to be an individual. It now appears that he was involved in murdering somebody he met in an apartment up the street in a pre-arranged meeting. That person tragically died. It seems to be at his hand. That'll be a matter for investigation. And he stabbed a woman, a stranger to him, in the street before. Thankfully, he was stopped by a very courageous response from 3 young lads from Manchester and an Australian lawyer and then firemen who were passing by. Very good response. Now, for those people responding, they couldn't stop and work out what the motivation was. They just had to respond, and it was clear they had to stop this guy from doing any further harm. That reminds us of the Borough Market attack, where 4 attackers with long knives, inspired by Islamic State, we believe, tried to attack people in the restaurant bar district across London Bridge. And thankfully, people stopped. They responded by throwing stools and chairs and trying to slow these guys down and save probably a tragic loss of life on a larger scale than what did occur before police turned up very quickly armed and ended the attack. So incident response is very important, whatever the motive, and police have to train to respond. We had 2 attacks with cars in Melbourne that are not terrorist related, involve drugs and mental health issues. But when an incident's occurring, you've got to deal with it as it occurs. Even in the Christchurch attack, which we do believe was a terrorist attack because of very clear evidence about political motive, white supremacist or far-right extremist motive. In the second mosque, the Linwood Mosque, although 8 lives were lost, many more could have been lost because in the first mosque, our Noor Mosque across the park, 42 lives were lost, or 43 lives were lost. The reason more lives weren't lost in the second mosque would appear to be that the gunman went back to the car to get another weapon with fresh ammunition, as he did in the Noor attack. But on this occasion was met by one of the worshippers who came out and picked up a discarded weapon. It had no ammunition, but smashed it through his windscreen, forcing the gunman to drive off. So we need to look at these incidents in terms of how you respond to them. But it is important to make this what can seem to be a pedantic distinction about motive. If the person believes they're acting for some political change, they're trying to provoke a political change, that's classified as terrorism. A lot of the attacks we're seeing in America, of course, Christchurch referenced an attack in a synagogue last year, and other attacks, many mass shootings in America. It's not clear what the motive, such as the Las Vegas attack, but many others, it's clear there's a political motive. American law makes it virtually impossible to prosecute those attacks on the grounds of terrorism unless there's an international organization involved. That's an anomaly of American law. But the gunman who, in all of these attacks, you get a sense of people looking for infamy, and so it's no point in mentioning his name. He doesn't deserve that. The gunman, who sadly was an Australian man, referenced the Norwegian terrorist of 2011, and that was significant because that Norwegian terrorist in July 2011 acted, he said, not because he was racist, but because he was unhappy with Muslim migration. And the phrase that has emerged in far-right discourse since then talks of a theory made popular by some French extremist philosophical thinkers, but picked up by many others and echoed really the words of President Donald Trump, that we're being replaced. Pauline Hanson, of course, back in 1996, and then through her first career in the Senate, spoke about being overrun by Asians. Now she's returned it in her second Senate career, talking about being overrun by Muslims. But that's the notion of being replaced. They're wiping us out, or they're changing our way of life. But in recent years, this has been articulated much more specifically, and so it's been referred to as the Great Replacement Thesis. It sounds very grand. Of course, it's bizarre because there's always been a change in societies and ethnic makeups over the years. No society is purely one thing or the other. Migration's been part of us even before this recent age of globalisation. But it comes down to a hateful othering of another group and singling them out as somehow deserving of punishment. Now, the gunman in Christchurch was fairly well known for his extremist ideas, but unfortunately those ideas are very, very common. So it was hard to anticipate that he would become an active violent extremist, terrorist. He was a hateful extremist. But of course, in one fell blow, he became Australia's worst terrorist and launched the worst terrorist attack in New Zealand, at least in the modern period. And a month later, we saw a different event in Sri Lanka, but it involved a group that was known for hateful extremism, in that case a Muslim group. Other Muslims, mainstream Sri Lankan Muslims, who generally get along very well with Christian, Hindu and other colleagues, Buddhist colleagues, spoke up and said, look, we're concerned about this group because we think that they're really very dangerous. Authorities didn't pay attention, unfortunately, partly because of political infighting, partly because of a fixation on the civil war that had ended a decade ago that involved an insurgency with a terrorist group, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, sort of a quasi-Hindu group fighting the Buddhist majority, Sinhalese majority. But my point in both cases is we had individuals known for their hateful extremism who suddenly became, unfortunately, very lethal terrorists and launched these attacks, in the case of Sri Lanka, very sophisticated attacks. And I think it's a reminder that we've got to pay more attention to the rhetoric of hate. We can quite rightly call it white supremacist hatred, but actually it goes across the world. So in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, we've had Buddhist clerics, as in Myanmar, famously with the Rohingya being forced out, and in Thailand, involved in sort of a kind of toxic nationalism in the name of religion. And we've had in India a ruling party, the BJP, on its coattails or sort of around the edges, finding support from Hindu extremists, Hindutva extremists. So it's a universal problem, but it should be acknowledged it's white men who are pushing this hateful thesis of being overrun by migrants, and particularly Muslims and Jews, in Western democracies. But unfortunately, it's not limited just to the West.
It does make me think what makes people vulnerable to this kind of language. Is it an economic vulnerability? Is there an element of racism? That term, the Great Displacement, you've described really well. But of course, what we're seeing now is various politicians and some in the media that seem to be using this rhetoric to really, I suppose, take advantage of that vulnerability that some have. Now, we don't see everyone acting on that vulnerability, of course, but when some people do seem to act on that vulnerability, it can be, can come out in some of the really dreadful circumstances we've seen. But of course, what we also see perhaps is that it manifests in other ways, perhaps not giving a certain group in our community housing or employment, and so on. So there's various ways that this kind of rhetoric can really manifest. We've seen those extreme circumstances, which are just awful. But it does make me wonder what makes people, again, vulnerable to that kind of rhetoric.
Well, I think it's an excellent question, Denise, and it is a vulnerability, and we do need to recognise that. Some people might say, well, when somebody's acting as a mass murderer why should we care what excuse they're making for inexcusable violence? And I understand that, but we need to understand motive if we're to try and interrupt the cycle of violence and interrupt recruitment and radicalization. What we have in common with modern terrorist movements is that they're social movements, even when the individual's acting alone. So the terrorists in the Norwegian attack in Oslo and in Utoya Island at the youth camp, you might recall, took elaborate selfies and posted them online. He planned 2 improvised explosive devices in downtown Oslo, only thankfully launched one because he was delayed getting out of his mother's apartment because he was trying to upload his 1,500-word manifesto. He was desperately concerned with how he was seen by what he imagined to be his community. And in the years since, unfortunately, he's become notorious, and many lionize him, including the gunman involved in Christchurch. Both cases, we have lone actors, but they saw themselves as playing to a virtual community, and they wanted to be accepted as hero warriors by these communities. So the gunman in Christchurch infamously live streamed his chilling attack and put it out there. He'd been communicating with people on these non-mainstream chat forums, 4chan and 8chan, which are known for being particularly notorious hangouts for right-wing extremists. And I think what all of this suggests is, as with people drawn to groups like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, or indeed groups like the IRA or ETA before them, in all the cases we can think of, we're looking at a social phenomenon. What's a little different now is we see so many lone actor attacks. But even so, those lone actors, and this is accelerated, as it were, by the internet and social media, feel themselves to be part of a virtual global community, and they want the praise of that global community. So it's a social response. So what is the vulnerability? Well, here's the really challenging thing. People who actively recruit, and with Islamic State we've seen very skillful recruitment, but we see it with right-wing extremists as well. They find people in a chat room, perhaps watching a video, responding to, making comments, and they befriend them, and they persuade them that they are their new best friend and that they understand them, and they understand their personal difficulties. They persuade them that they understand their personal difficulties, not just because they talk to them and build their confidence, but because they appeal to a human weakness for conspiracy thinking, saying that, look, the difficult struggles that you've been having are part of a grand cosmic struggle, whether it's the great displacement of migration, Muslims, Jews, whatever, or whether it's because mainstream Muslims are not being sufficiently pure in their faith, and you have to join us in championing the caliphate, or whatever other interpretation there may be. So it's a social process offering belonging, acceptance, giving people a sense of purpose. The underlying narrative that justifies it is a conspiratorial narrative about a cosmic struggle. People generally come for the social connection, and then later on are persuaded by the grand narrative. Just like with mainstream religion, if people convert in religious terms, it generally starts with a social contact, and then they later on internalize the ideas of their